Hello, Professor Val Curran. You're Professor of Psychopharmacology at UCL and a member of Drug Science. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Pierre. How are you?
I'm well too, thank you, and thrilled that we can have this conversation for Cardiff University. Um, could could we just kick off by thanking you, by the way, for all of the work that you're doing, raising the profile of this subject in the public's eye. It's brilliant, thank you. Um, I would love it if you could please talk about harm reduction, please.
Um, Harm reduction in terms of using cannabis medicinally.
And also for the people who are
Recreation.
recreational users.
Okay. Where do I start? First of all, a lot of our work has pointed to the importance of the type of cannabis you use in terms of its effects. And I think what that we tried to show in the program Drugs Live and what we've done on Radio 4 on the Cannabis Week was to show some of our findings about how skunk type cannabis, and this is really cannabis with a THC level of 15% or more, so very potent. But particularly important, it has virtually no CBD, which is cannabidiol. And what we found in our research over the last 8 or 9 years is that if you take that kind of cannabis, which now dominates 80% of the market in the UK, is this type of cannabis. It's very difficult to buy other types. But by smoking this kind of skunk, it's more addictive, and also not only our own work, but also Marta Di Forti's work has shown that people smoking this type of cannabis are more likely to experience a psychotic episode. So number one for harm reduction is try and avoid these very high potency THC strains that have no CBD. There are lots of other strains, and the names that people use for cannabis are not always very clear. What I found is that there are more words for cannabis in most languages than Eskimos have words for snow, actually. So we can talk about hash, which tends to be the Moroccan variety, which is grown outside, which is a mixture of types with different levels of CBD and THC, and is rolled in traditional ways to form resin lumps. I mean, that tends to have decent CBD levels of sort of around 8 or even 10%. So I think, one kind of harm reduction is to try and avoid the high potency skunk varieties. Another harm reduction tip is we all know the problems for health of tobacco. So it applies very much if you're using cannabis, that do not roll it with tobacco. Find other ways of ingesting it. There are lots of other ways people make butter, they make cakes. We use a special inhalator called a Volcano. There are, I know in Spain now, companies just producing CBD-only type electronic cigarettes. So the market is developing very rapidly at the moment with other ways of being able to use cannabinoids. And the other thing is to control your use. If you're finding you're wanting it in the morning, then it's time to take a break, take a holiday. If you use it consistently, daily, you might be developing a problem of dependence. And although, scientists talk hugely about the link between cannabis and psychosis is very rare compared to addiction to cannabis. Of people who start using cannabis, 9% will become addicted. And that's a lot of people, given there's 180 million users in the world.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's always been interesting for us is that in the United Kingdom, the vast majority of recreational smokers, obviously with the tobacco, the role that nicotine plays Would you be able to elucidate a little bit why the nicotine makes the cannabis activity even more addictive?
I'm not sure we understand that much about the interaction between nicotine and cannabis per se. People mostly use the tobacco as a vehicle for making it smoke more easily. And so much so that in the UK, I mean, you could say that cannabis use has almost become a gateway drug to cigarette use.
Yes.
It's almost the reverse of what happened years ago. Nowadays, people are smoking cannabis, and because they're exposed to nicotine, which is highly addictive, much more addictive than cannabis, then they're ending up smoking cigarettes.
Yes, yeah, that's really worth knowing. Thank you for sharing that. What we are also very interested to know about is we know that you've been following some epilepsy trials. Would you like to share that information, please?
Well, I think at the moment we're living in a very exciting time that, the cannabis plant is literally a kind of treasure chest of potential medicines. And we're only at the beginning of that quest now. We have one drug called Sativex, which is a mixture in equal ratios of THC and CBD, which is used for spasms in multiple sclerosis. And THC on its own has long been used in this country for nausea associated with radiotherapy and for increasing appetite in people with terminal AIDS. But more recently, the potential of CBD itself as a medicine has become to the forefront. We ourselves are doing a lot of work with clinical trials with CBD for cannabis addiction here at UCL. But perhaps the most exciting trials, there are 5 going on in the States at the moment and 1 in Scotland, are for CBD in the treatment of childhood epilepsy, particularly very severe forms of epilepsy, such as Dravet syndrome. I mean, that is very severe. Children will have multiple major fits every single day. We haven't got the final published results yet, but everyone's very excited that it's having a fantastic effect on these children, that suddenly an awful lot of them are becoming free of epileptic seizures after years of not being able to participate in society, not have a life that you'd want a normal kid to have.
Yeah.
So that's very exciting. And lots of other trials are going on at the moment in all sorts of indications. I mean, we have cannabinoid receptors in our brains, so that's why a lot of the interest in addiction and epilepsy and other psychiatric indications are happening. But there are also cannabinoid receptors in the immune system, so there's a lot of work on potential effects of different cannabinoids in cancer.
Oh yes, you mentioned cancer because it's interesting how THC has effect on cancer cells, and CBD has a different way of doing things, but also seems to be playing a part. I think the entourage effect is going to be something that is going to be an absolute joy for scientists to unpick over the next decade.
Yeah, I think we're understanding the brain's natural cannabis, our own endocannabinoid system, much more now. It's a very exciting area, but at the same time we have to wait for the clinical trials to finish before. We don't want people to have their hopes raised and then find out it doesn't work at all. The placebo effect is a very strong effect. Yeah,
quite so. Yes, quite so. I'm absolutely thrilled at having this chance to talk to you today. Before we go, if there's anything that you would like to share with the people at Cardiff University, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, we've talked a bit about psychosis, a bit about addiction. I suppose the other major effect of cannabis that people are concerned about are its cognitive effects. When people smoke a spliff or whatever, eat some THC or whatever, they will experience memory problems. And it's important to be aware of that. I mean, that the onset after smoking is very rapid, a few minutes, and it could last for an hour or up to 2 hours if you take it orally. And if you're a student or a school kid, this kind of accumulative memory problem, it doesn't accumulate over time, but it's not going to help you revise or study if you're experiencing those effects. On the other hand, most of the research, because of the politics of drugs, most of the research on cannabis has been about its negative effects over the years. In fact, if you're an American researcher, it's very hard to get grant money to show anything about drugs other than their negative effects. But we try and balance it, because I think we're more credible as scientists if we give out more balanced messages about drugs. And what we showed recently, and I think in that trial that was shown on Channel 4, was that there are positive effects, that the brain responds as much more, a much greater response to music that you actually enjoy when you're on cannabis. I mean, any sort of cannabis, as long as it's got THC in, you will enjoy something like music more. So there are positive effects. There are also physical effects. One thing we didn't show on the program is that skunk increases your blood pressure significantly more than hash type varieties, even though it's the same level of THC in the two drugs we compared. If you had the CBD in the cannabis, then your blood pressure was fine. It didn't differ from placebo. Without the CBD, the THC pushes it right up, and that's a health risk we all know from high blood pressure.
Absolutely, absolutely. Professor Curran, thank you ever so much.
A pleasure.